Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. This is episode 32 of the Story Savvy series, where we tackle the 52 biggest self editing topics and tips to help you make your good story great. As a published author, asks me, a developmental editor, all of the questions that you have wanted to. My usual co host Agnes and I have covered a bunch in this series so far. And last week, Addy and I went over avoiding scene stagnation by adding variety and interest. Today, we are going to take a look at intangible world building in self editing. By the end of this episode, you'll hopefully feel confident in what the intangible aspects of world building are, know how to check and use them, and have a solid idea of where you may need to tweak those aspects in your own self editing. Joining me to ask all of these questions is my friend and the author of One Season with the Duke and the Troublemakers Trilogy, Addy DuLac. Welcome.
You.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your writing, whatever you feel like mentioning, before we dive in with our questions here?
Hello. So a little bit about me, in case you're unaware. Of course, I am Addy DuLac. I primarily write interracial historical romance set in right now in Victorian England. I've released three books between my two publishers. My first novel with Entangled was One Season with the Duke, the aforementioned, and it won three Emma Awards for Best Novel, Best Debut, and Best Interracial Romance. Yay! Thank you, thank you. Um, my first trilogy called The Troublemakers is being released. It is currently still being released by with Dragonblade Publishing. It features three heroines from diverse backgrounds, and they're equally rebellious male leads, taking on racial, familial, and social tensions while they fight for their right to love, live, and thrive in Victorian England. Um, I love drama, angst, and steam. My favorite primary tropes are arranged marriage, marriage of convenience, and adversaries slash enemies to lovers. And sometimes they're enemies, and sometimes they just don't like each other, and that's enough. It doesn't always need to be, you know, a travesty. So I tend to write in third person dual or sometimes triple POV, mostly because it's my favorite to read or write. I am no shade to anybody. I'm not a big fan of first person. It makes me crazy. But I do, but I don't I think also because sometimes it's not always, I mean, it's the same thing with third person. Third person deep POV is the best, but third person can be boring. And it's the same thing with first person, right? Sometimes first person, you read a first person, like I've read first person novels despite my lack of interest and been like, this is amazing. And I've read the book in one day and it was amazing. Then there are
To
other
each
ones.
their own,
Right.
absolutely.
Then I've also read like first person, like even with first person, it's sometimes it grabs me and it pulls me in. And then
Mhm.
for others, it's like you didn't, I don't think you know how this is supposed to work, right? Like sort of thing. So I think sometimes it's up to the skill of the author, and sometimes it's just people are weird like me.
Yeah.
So my fourth novel, and the last in the Troublemakers trilogy, is due for release in September. It's called Miss Hawthorne's Unlikely Husband, and it follows Miss Elodia Hawthorne and the challenges she takes on to marry the man she's loved since she was 15 years old.
Cool.
So fun stuff.
I'm excited for that.
Yeah, yeah, it's good times. She's the daughter of a viscount,
Nice.
and you've met her in book one. And he is essentially, he's very rich, but he is essentially a merchant.
Mhm.
He owns his family. He has a lot of like what they call it, intergenerational wealth,
Okay.
because his family, they've owned these mercantile mills for a while.
Mhm.
So he has a lot of money, but he's still a merchant. So he's not quite Charles Bingley yet. So there's some questions about that and like you know
And
whether
it
they should
sounds
be
like some
getting
def
married.
and it sounds like some fun, spaces to explore in the novel.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of hijinks going on,
Yeah.
but yeah, but that's book three. So fun
Awesome.
times. Okie dokie. Well, let's get into our questions.
Okay.
So intangible world building seems like a bit of an enigma of a topic, and
Sure.
I can think of a bunch of different things that could mean. So let's first define what intangible world building is. What are we actually talking about here?
So, intangible world building is any world building that has nothing to do with the tangible aspects like geography and buildings, clothing, things like that.
Mm.
So, magic systems, like I talked about back in episode 27, could count as intangible world building, but what we're talking about in this episode applies to all genres. Just to list some of the things that count under this category, we're looking at cultural markers, name choices for characters, places, and objects, what curses and expletives and exclamations the people in your story use, music, writing, communication, social considerations, religion, and everything like that. Where intangible world building informs the world of the story and impacts how things move forward is going to be mostly or entirely within the heads of the characters rather than physical aspects of their world.
So it sounds like all this is centered around the internal aspects of the character and how they perceive or think about things.
Yeah.
So, are there any ways in which we need to be cautious in creating these elements? Any ways we might turn a reader off from the story in ways that we may be blind to, since these things are often heavily influenced by our own worldview as a writer and the lens we see our own work through?
Yes, there is some room for caution there, but again, know your audience, what they are like, what they like, and own that. I've talked about this in so many different episodes. I personally have read books with what I thought was jarringly hip and trendy intangible world building and references that these characters were making, um, in contrast to the physical setting. But the author knew their audience, and my research into their niche backed them up on that. Historical, high fantasy, and writing about a culture you've never lived are, I feel, where you need to be the most careful. For the latter, specifically that writing about cultures that you've never experienced per se, I definitely refer listeners back to episode 12, where I think that was a guest host on that one, covered sensitivity checks and using sensitivity readers, things like that. But for historical and high fantasy, it's really about making sure that you have the right guardrails on
Mhm.
things. So if you know you're writing Victorian romance, then referencing, hey, give me a call doesn't make a lot of sense unless you're like late Victorian,
Mhm.
or talking about an app would be wildly
Yeah,
inappropriate.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
if
yeah.
you're writing medieval, saying that a conversation went off the tracks isn't acceptable because they had
Right,
not invented trains yet.
right, exactly.
So, knowing what your guardrails are on these intangible, how people think about things, the vocabulary that they use, the way they see gender and sexuality and different ethnicities and religion and how they gauge good and evil, all of these kind of things are really, really important.
Mhm. And also with respect to when you talk about knowing your audience, it is one of those, just because specifically in historical romance, it becomes one of those things where like there's one thing with knowing what the accurate thing is, and then there's also what your readers expect. And knowing, right? And like knowing that they don't want it to be too accurate, right? Like they talk about it, but they don't really want to talk about the realities of using the bathroom in Regency England. And like they don't want to deal with that, right?
And
It's
even
like,
some things where you present it accurately, it will sound wrong because your reader knows less about history than you do. And I
Yeah.
encourage everyone to Google the Tiffany problem.
I was about to bring that up.
Yes.
Yeah, I was like, and for those not in the know, because just a quick overview of the Tiffany problem. The Tiffany problem is people hear the name Tiffany, and they assume that it's anachronistic. And the reality is the name Tiffany has been used since the Middle Ages.
Early Middle
And
Ages. Yeah.
early Middle Ages, yeah. So it's been around for a minute. But people hear words and they assume, oh no, it can't be used this way. And in one of my books, it was babe or baby, like a
Mhm.
man calling his love a baby. And I had some people be like, that seems really modern, and I'm like, it's really not.
Yeah.
It's really
And
not.
it can also just be a case of people putting their own experience of modern life onto these historical characters.
Mm,
And the best example I have of that is corset wearing in
yeah.
the Victorian ages. In reality, women were wearing corsets since they were toddlers, and they
Mhm.
weren't tight lacing. They were
No.
not rearranging their organs or their skeletal structure for the most part, but it
No.
was a very necessary exoskeleton. As someone
Hmm.
who has done Victorian reenactment, those dresses, those hoop skirts,
They're
those top
heavy.
layers of petticoats,
Yeah.
they will dig into your hips so bad unless
Yeah.
you're wearing a boned corset.
Yeah.
So one of those things is that in historical romance, I often see these characters being so desperate to, get away with not wearing a corset, and that's totally not accurate to the
Like
reality.
never.
But
Yeah.
every reader is going to think that that is true. So
Yeah.
there's a balance there that the author needs to decide on for themselves of, do you want to
Yeah.
be accurate where women just wear corsets like modern women wear underwear? Or do you
Right.
want to pander to an audience who at this point has been conditioned to
Mhm.
think that Victorian women didn't like wearing the corsets by other authors who have presented that?
Yeah, and it's also about waist training, right? There's so like it's like this is not. It's like a bra. The first time you wear a bra, I think a bra is a perfectly good example, actually. If you
Sure.
think about it, the first few times you put on a bra, it's not comfortable. It's very, very annoying, and especially if you're wearing an ill-fitting bra, it can be the bane of your existence the whole time. But if you're used to wearing them, and or especially if your proportions like mine are such that it's like, no, I can get really uncomfortable if I'm not wearing one, right? Especially if I'm trying to do any kind of activity, right? It can be almost painful, right? So it's one
Sure.
of those things where it's like, no, 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 this sucker needs to come with me, right? And if it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's just badly fitted. Maybe you need a different kind, right? Maybe your
Yeah.
bra needs a different structure.
Or it's
But
wearing out and you need to replace it.
and you need to replace it. Maybe
Yeah.
it's jabbing you in the arm because the stupid thing broke. Like maybe
Yes.
that's one of the things, right?
Yeah.
But it
So,
doesn't mean. But yeah, but like
and that's a great
if
example of sort of the tangible world building, but the mindsets around it
right,
definitely apply to this intangible. So that
yeah,
mindset of, do I want to be wearing a bra or a corset? Would I
right,
rather not be if I could get away with it? That is going to impact how that character chooses to dress when they wake up in the morning.
right,
That's going to impact how they feel if they end up being observed without this necessary undergarment.
right,
And it's those sort of mindset things that can or cannot be related to the tangibles like clothing
yeah,
that we are really trying to talk about here, and that I am encouraging authors to think about and pay attention to and tweak as needed in their books.
yeah. Especially like if you think it's like, oh my god, I don't want to wear this. Could you imagine a girl like she's just like it's in a Victorian setting and she's just like, I don't want to wear this corset, and she manages to I don't know how the hell she would get away with it, but say she manages to sneak out and she doesn't have it on, and then the whole time that she's out around other people, she feels like naked because she knows she doesn't have it on. And she's like, I thought I would be comfortable, but I really am like on a personal level, I now feel uncomfortable because I wish I had this stupid thing on, right?
Yes.
So fun stuff. So I imagine the intangible world building elements need to be more of a driving force to a story than the tangible ones. For example, I think many stories could take place in a totally different location and still be a very different story. But if those authors were to change the belief systems of the characters or the rules of the society, suddenly the story just could not happen in a remotely similar way. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And both intangible and tangible matter to the story being told, but I think
Mhm.
the intangibles require a lot more thought and intentional choices
Mm,
around, which is part of why we're addressing this before the tangible. So
Right.
And like you just mentioned, in your genre of historical romance, that is a perfect example of this. So medieval, Regency, and suffragette era
Mhm.
romances all have very unique, intangible world building that they are built on and built within by simply deciding what country and decade you want to set the story in.
Mhm.
So when you are making these intangible choices, those major societal considerations are a big one. Are you
Mhm.
setting it in a place where women don't have rights, or that they're fighting for them, or that they've had them for a long time? Are you
Yeah.
setting the story in a time and place where you can kind of choose what religion you want to be, or are you setting the story in a time and place where you have to be this one religion and you have to be so visibly and devoutly, or you're in big trouble? All
Yeah.
of these considerations really, really matter.
Mhm.
But it can overlap a lot. So
Mhm.
if you want a setting, a tangible setting of a small town, that's going to have different intangibles than a tangible setting of a major city
City.
like Alexandria or
Mhm.
London. So there's some overlap, but I suggest picking a setting on your intangibles at least as much as the visuals.
Mhm. Yeah. I think also for me, because I write interracial, and a lot of my like for troublemakers, the majority of the both of the leads are non BIPOC characters, right? So as if you're going through Victorian England as a black sort of solidly middle class man versus right a Chinese wealthy merchant class who's had everything. It's the perspective is going to be different, and you're going to be watching people differently. They're going to be seeing you differently. It just, and the way you move and the choices you make are going to be affected by that intangible thing, right?
Yeah,
So, how do we know what elements of our intangible world building are critical and which ones might just be extra fluff and irrelevant to our story?
sure. So I feel like everything that we've talked about so far is done a decent job of illustrating what matters
Yes.
and how it impacts choices and reactions to things. So when you're trying to make this call of whether or not it's impactful or irrelevant, make sure that each aspect has a nameable impact on the world and avatars, and that these aspects are affecting the story enough to justify full inclusion instead of leaving them to subtext.
Mhm.
Because if it's fluff, if you're spending 3 paragraphs on it, that's a problem. But if it's fluff and it's a word choice in one sentence on a page, that doesn't matter. That is totally fine. It's all dependent on how much addressing or how much page space its importance earns. So, especially in fantasy, which is my genre, where you really need to introduce every aspect because it's fantasy and people can't
Mhm.
always default to something, as opposed to historical, where a lot of that can be taken for granted. The location and social standing and rough technology level really need to be established, but you don't need to keep harping on it. So my answer to your question about how to gauge that is exactly what you were just talking about. Does a specific aspect serve to steer the story at any point? Does it give the protagonist an opportunity that they would not otherwise have, such as setting your story in a place where, like you were just saying, an Asian man who is a wealthy merchant can have opportunities that, let's say, his father in a different country would not have had, then
Right.
that intangible is worth mentioning. You can also ask if this mention or this inclusion illuminates a mindset or a personality trait or fears or goals or that kind of stuff in a way that is important to how the story unfolds. Once you've asked yourself all of these questions, use them to decide if the job that that intangible world building aspect is doing is worth the words that you are spending and including on it, and just make a quick call. This does not have to be something that you have to dwell on. It's really sort of a polishing thing, so it's kind of up to you.
Yeah. So I know this series is geared towards fantasy.
Sure.
So for those writers, how do you suggest keeping track of these intangible world-building decisions? So, or decisions, whichever one, so that they can keep things consistent across the book or the series. And if someone chooses to pick a roughly Renaissance default setting for their world, do all of their intangibles have to fit that too, or can they mix and match?
So, answering the first part of that question for just how to keep track of the decisions that you made, and this does apply to historical in some ways, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
fantasy even more so.
Sure
I
does.
suggest a series Bible, and this is just a document where you keep all of these notes that you want to be consistent across. You can do a series Bible for a standalone; it doesn't matter. But
You sure can.
the idea is that when you have a thought of, wait, what was the religion in this world like? Or what kind of rights do this group of people have? You
Mm-hmm.
have it written down somewhere that you can quickly find and check against to make sure that you're being consistent. Another way to approach this or overlap with that advice is stick to a theme to keep you on track. And the episode that I did on magic systems definitely touches on this. So in my books, I have a couple of guiding bumpers, like I was talking about earlier. I've just got these bumpers of, okay, it's modern technology, but XYZ historical events went differently. So now this is the sort of political situation of the globe. And then all of my magic has to come through auras or demons. If I can't specifically name how a magic thing comes through one of those two narrow channels, I need to find a different way to write that scene. So
Mm-hmm.
having just mindsets and themes and statements like that to stay centered on can be very helpful. I also recommend doing many rereads of your manuscript through the self-editing process. That's not groundbreaking, but it's worth mentioning. And then accept that you may just miss some things. As tough as that is, I think I mentioned this in the episode on catching plot holes.
Mm-hmm.
There are best-selling novels out in the world who went through traditional editors over and over and over, and there's still plot holes, and
Yeah.
there's still world building inconsistencies, and you need to accept that that's just going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, in answering the second part of your question there, which was if you're doing fantasy and you pick a historical real life base background, do you have to keep all of your intangible aspects geared towards that? And the answer there is essentially no. Just know what that default is, and when you deviate, do so clearly and intentionally. And make sure that if your mixing and matching contradicts itself, you introduce an explanation. And then
Mm-hmm.
also setting up all of those different layers of explanations or expectations early on can be very helpful. So, to give an example addressing those last 2 points there, if you pick Renaissance 16th century Italy as your default backdrop, but you want more of a 10th century England religious mindset, but with 21st century gender equality, then you really want to find a way to show those three different aspects in the first chapter, and at least to some small degree, and
Mm-hmm.
present your logic about how those three things can coexist logically within a single cultural worldview mindset as soon as you can do so gracefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's sort of like it's not as in depth as this, but it was something with an author group I have. We were talking about like when things come across as sort of anachronistic, and you're just like, oh well, this doesn't, or the butler shouldn't be doing this, right? Or like the valet shouldn't be doing this. Like it's like why would you have the butler doing this? And it's one of those things where like the general reader's not going to catch it, but like there's going to be a handful of readers that will. And my caveat, or like, he shouldn't be calling her this, he shouldn't be calling her by her first name, or these like random like rules about, like etiquette and all the rest of it. It's like half the people don't care, but there are half that will. And you as an author may not give a damn. And you're like, I'm not rewriting the scene. And I feel like, and one of the things you can do to get around that, with you saying about like explaining, I always say, I'm like, it's not the done thing, but it works for me. And it's just like, there you go. It's
If you
like,
can convince the reader that
yeah,
it makes sense,
yeah.
you should be fine.
Yeah, as long I'm like it needs to make, but more in the sense of like the character's aware. It's like the intangible. The character's aware of the fact that
Yes.
this is not what other people should. This is not what the butler should be doing. And more importantly, you can have the butler be aware of the fact that this is not what he should be doing. But he
Yes.
raised this child. He's like, Alfred from Batman, and he's like, it should not be my job, but you're lucky that I love you. So I'm still here and I'm going to do it. And then you just have
Yeah.
this, like, just with that one introduction, if you have like any servant doing something that you're just like, should they be doing this? Like, well, he does have that really sassy butler who doesn't want to be helping him with his cravat. So maybe this is just a thing in his household. And you're like, it's a thing in his household. Leave me alone. Let me live my life. Right.
That is an
Move on.
excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, move on to chapter 6. Like, it's fine. So okay, so I also know that this is a self-editing series. So, but I have noticed sometimes in my self-editing, I'm frequently going back to the bare bones of my world and brainstorming as if it was the beginning all over again. I have done this. When we're trying to develop the intangible world building aspects, what types of questions should we be asking ourselves as we brainstorm?
Mm. So again, you can, as you touched on in your last question, pick a default real life starting point. And in historical, this is kind of the whole job. In
Yeah,
fantasy, it's again a starting point, somewhere
yeah,
to launch off from.
mhm,
Then, if applicable, name the biggest thing or things that you think deviates around those intangibles. And just a couple of the common versions of that I see are women getting a lot more respect or freedom or independence than would be historically defensible for that time and place. But then again, who wants to read historically accurate misogyny all the time? Nobody.
right.
So from there, once you have that starting point and have named the biggest deviation from the reality of that starting point, try just brainstorming world statements the exact same way you would for your characters. And I went over this in detail in the characters episode. What is the general disposition or vibe around pessimism or optimism or communal versus independence, etc., for your world, viewing this world as a character and these intangibles as personality traits of this character? What does this society or culture want, such as conformity or creative expression or exploitation and wealth disparity, or justice, or anarchy, or harmony between different clans? What does this society or government or whatever else, what have they grown out of? What
Mhm,
is the chapter in their past that sort of defines what they ended up being now? What purpose or role does this world serve to the characters in the story? How does this world's personality, to couch it in those terms, hinder the characters or make their life more difficult, force them to explore aspects of your theme? What are the superstitions that this world believes in? What curses and expletives and exclamations does this world use, and why, if you really want to get deep on it?
mhm,
Do people in this world, does this world as a whole believe in an afterlife? What kind? What earns your place? Are there multiple options? And there are so many other things that you can consider and write them out as character statements. And like I talked about in the character episode, just go back and check it as you're doing your self editing on this and see if the characterization of your world is being consistent and what you wanted it to be.
mhm. So, how do memes, expletives, music, and the like help to enhance our story and give the reader a little more intense experience?
Immersion.
Oh yeah.
Above all else, it is immersion. It can also, so let me stay on immersion for a second. So, what I mean by immersion is that as a reader is going through, and this is going to vary depending on the individual, but generally, a reader wants to feel like they can be in this world, like they can imagine themselves standing in the shoes of these characters, or write fanfic where they are another character in this same sort of setting. And immersion is going to help them feel connected and invested in all of those kind of things. Beyond immersion, it's about relatability. So that overlaps. You want your readers to be able to go, oh, I've felt, shamed for something that I don't think should be shameful in my society.
Mhm.
Well, now these characters are experiencing that. I can relate and I'm going to get emotionally invested in that. It can also be about depth. And this is for immersion and relatability, but mostly for the author when I'm talking about depth. Because all of the authors, particularly the fantasy authors that I know, they have this concept of this beautiful, vibrant, rich fantasy world. And you get to explore that for yourself as much as anything else. So deciding what instruments they play. All right, well, do those instruments have a specific key range? All right, well, what music does that lend itself to? Is music shamed or encouraged? All of this kind of stuff can just deepen that world, and that depth, I think, is a huge part of why Lord of the Rings has such an enduring, rabid fan base because it
Mhm.
is so very deep in
Yeah.
the tangible and intangible world building that is created and presented. So, going off of that, just think about all of those massive fan bases out there. Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, His Dark Materials, A Court of Thorns and Roses, any massive fandom that you can think of, they all have expletives and descriptions of
Mhm.
food and music and so much more that fans love trying to recreate or use as inside references. And imagine if you write a series, if you were to host an author ball and invite all of your fans, would they have some idea of, "Oh, I hope they have llama spread," or,
Mm.
"Oh, we can dress like those dresses that were described in the midwinter ball," whatever it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah.
Those are the kind of details that fandoms are based on.
Mm.
So when you are looking at your expletives and music and name choices, that is all going to add to that sense of fandom. And then very lastly on this, specifically to names, names can play a huge part in maintaining a consistent tone for the story. One of my personal pet peeves is reading high fantasy with these gorgeous, unique, inventive, one of a kind, ethereal names, and then some guy named Greg shows up. And his wife Alice.
Yeah.
And it just breaks that
Yeah.
cultural, intangible tone of the story.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about names and you're thinking about these intangibles, please try to maintain a coherent tone across all of them.
Yeah. Nobody in Gondor was named Fred, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So, and even Sam was Samwise,
Yes.
right? It's like, I'm like, which is another thing where you get to like nicknames. It's like you can work with this. I'm also thinking of like the is it the Grisha verse with Shadow and Bone and
Yeah.
like all that good stuff. When you're talking about names, I always think about that and how like she sort of, I don't know whether she did it intentionally or not, but she sort of inverted like the pronunciation of the last names,
Mm.
like with Alina being Starkov instead of Starkova,
Yeah.
and then like the men having the A at the end, where it's just like technically that's supposed to be for women, but it was so cleanly done and
Yes.
so universally done, where I'm just like, this is clearly set in like late Victorian Russia, but I'm gonna let it. I mean, I'm like, so it's that the world is very clear about like where you are, but at the same time, you're just like, I'm gonna pretend that you did this on purpose because it's too consistent to be a mistake. Like,
Consistency is key. You
it
can do
saves so
whatever
much.
you want, just do
Yeah,
it consistently.
right. They're like, it's like, do you know that you did this? I'm like, did you notice that I did it the whole way through the novel? And it's just like, yeah, it's like that was on purpose then. Yeah, you
Yep.
know. So, do you have an example where the intangible world building aspects really made or broke the story?
Yes. So this kind of leans more into tangible than intangible, but
Mm.
one of my biggest pet peeves in high fantasy, and I hate to say it, but specifically ACOTAR series, is they have flushing toilets. And they have elastic socks and leggings. And
Right, 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 right,
there's just
right.
lots of little things where the author clearly went, well, I could do the historical version, but that sounds way too inconvenient. So I'm just going to default to modern. But that doesn't match the high fantasy medieval
Mm,
setting. Beyond that, some most of the time I run into this, it's in historical fiction of some sort
mm,
or like low fantasy where it's very close to a historical setting, but people have or the author has made a specific choice. And some examples of that that I can remember from books I've either read or worked on are atheists in a
mm.
medieval setting, and that's never actually addressed. And they're still very open about it, and nothing ever comes of it. And it's just one of those things where a reader can clock it and go, that intangible doesn't fit with all of this other world building. What's going on?
Yeah,
And then, like we were talking about earlier, no one goes to the effort of explaining it or making it make
yeah.
sense to the reader in that moment. And then the other example that I have a little note of here is Regency steampunk fantasy with cultural references that made me think way too hard about where and how and why and when the timeline diverged by quoting Shakespeare.
Okay.
And it can
Yeah,
be little things like that because it's Victorian, it's Regency. Yeah, Shakespeare predates that. It could happen. But if the world started deviating from our reality earlier, did Shakespeare exist? Did
yeah,
he get to write his plays? Did they become,
yeah.
famous? So
Right.
any kind of cultural reference, unless you're writing in reality and you've checked that reference, is a very common tiny little red flag of, oop, hold on, that you need to watch out for in your intangibles.
Yeah, yeah. That would make wow, yeah, like when you said what is it called? Yeah, an atheist in like medieval, and I was just like
Mm.
and that my brain immediately went, I don't know about medieval, but it would make a hell of a lot of sense in the Renaissance, actually.
It would make more sense, but you still look at the historical context and they didn't have that word really. And
Well, I mean,
you were
oh,
still
so
expected
okay.
to default to go to church or respect church elders or observe the Sabbath, these different
Well,
religious things that were just built into that culture so deeply.
well, I mean, to me, whether when you're if you're an atheist, that simply means you don't believe in God. Whether you're following the practice of religion has nothing to do with whether your faith,
Sure.
right? So that which is more where I was going with it. So I can actually see writing a character, but again, what I was thinking is Renaissance. This is after the Black Death and the occurrence of the Black Death, and more the way the clergy behaved, the way the church dealt with it or didn't deal with it in a lot of circumstances,
Yeah.
actually led to a lot of the, shall we say, problems
Right.
that later on, right? Because you're
Right.
dealing with you. There's a reason that you have like Martin Luther happening technically in like late Renaissance, but there's a reason it's happening then and not in the Middle Ages, because before they were like, surely the church wouldn't do that, and then they get to the point where they're like, they will absolutely leave you high and dry. They don't care about anything, right?
But see, that right there is thinking about
Right,
those intangibles.
right,
And if you were the author of this book, you, based on this conversation, would have considered those things and
yeah,
made choices and would have gone to the effort of having one sentence somewhere where the protagonist goes, I lost my entire family to the Black Plague, and I cannot bring myself to believe in a God who would commit that level of
yeah,
suffering on innocent good people.
yeah,
And that's all it takes
yeah.
to really make these intangibles land, but you still need to do it.
Right, exactly. You still need to, like, you can't assume that people are just going to be like, everything's fine. It's a fantasy. And it's just like,
Yes,
yeah,
or
but
the
like,
author just decided that she needed more character points for this character, so she decided
right.
that this, that, and the other thing, and then
Like even in the show, because my friend started me watching it, like A Discovery of Witches,
mm,
like the idea that like Queen Elizabeth, what I like about it is that you have in certain areas, like there's a sort of acceptance that witches exist. So
mm,
like in England they're not necessarily burning anybody, but they're also at the same time acknowledging that in Scotland witch trials are actively going on. And so you're like, ooh, this is tricky because at that point Scotland and England are separate kingdoms, right? So you're just like, ooh, this could be interesting. And then you're looking at them like, y'all better move before she dies. And James comes down here because he's gonna
Seriously. Yeah.
because he writes that giant witch hunting book, and you're like, oh no, that this is gonna get a little awkward for y'all. Y'all better bounce. But
Yeah.
it's like, but
And
like
that was
little
the
things,
author making a great intangible choice because
right?
those
Exactly.
intangibles of that setting choice wildly deeply impact that story. And that's part
Yeah.
of why I also really enjoy that series.
Right. Yeah. Like I've never read it, but like I mean, it was Matthew Good, so I was gonna watch it.
Sure.
But like, I'm like whatever, So, but yeah, it was I immediately started thinking it was like, but you have to be very careful. You really do have to be. You have to know. I think also when you're grounding yourself a little too much in a historical setting, like when you're going a little too not too close to the sun, as it were, but when you're really when you're trying to pull a discovery of witches, let's say that, like you have to know that time period in a way, like you'd have to know it in a way that like on the same level as if I'm setting a story in Tudor England. Like you'd have to understand, and you'd also have to be able you'd have to know that as well as the like as how the history played out, the also I'm thinking the socio-political ramifications, right? Because you can't just have Queen Elizabeth the First die earlier, and then you're just like, that means all this other stuff is happening, and it's like, so it's like you have to see how the ripple effect, and you have to pay attention to that, and you can't just leave it alone. Like that would give me so much anxiety. Like this is part of why I was like, I want to, but at the same time, I'm just like, I could not do this because it's so like I'm just like now I literally have to rewrite history. Like the
Yeah.
furthest back I would go is like maybe Napoleon wins. That's about as far back as I'll go. So much stuff after that is like well documented, so I can like discuss it.
And if I ever write historical anything, I my plan is to just stay away from major historical characters. Like Queen
Right.
Elizabeth would never be a feature. No, no, no. My character would
Nowhere.
live in some small village in Wales
Exactly.
and have minimal impact on anything. And
Right. This is the thing that which is so funny when it comes to which is something that is interesting, like when you write history, like I do when it comes into the matter of historical record. I'm
Mhm.
like, because to a certain degree you have to rely on it, but also to a certain degree it's like there's so much that is not entered into the historical record because you have to consider who is going to be in the historical record, and it's not going to be me. Like I would not, like me as I am, like I would not be in, not even as a black person, just on my socioeconomic level, there's
Right.
no historical record for me. Like the
Yeah.
most I get is I was born and I
And
died at
you
some
died on this
point.
date.
Yeah, and they possibly got married, right? Like, did you have children? Yeah, they got some kids got baptized, and they said I was the mother. But
Yeah.
nobody's looking into, like, depending on where you are, they may not be taking note of like your ethnicity. They may not be taking real note of what your family life was like. Like, there's so much of it that's just like nobody knows. Just
And
here,
that's a fun thing to think about where that
right?
tangible of the records
Yeah,
overlaps with those intangibles of but they did live.
they did live.
And they did have mindsets and beliefs and educational backgrounds that
Mhm.
we can try to piece together. And
Yeah,
that's what the fiction is for.
exactly. Or did they live? Did they fake the records? Dun dun
Yes.
dun. But okay, moving swiftly on. Um, I know we need to wrap up. But I do want to ask one last question. When should we establish these intangible world building elements? You kind of touched on it earlier. Should they
Mhm.
evolve over the course of the story, or and what should are some best practices around doing so? As I assume you never want to like throw everything in the beginning and info dump, right?
Yes, please don't info dump. Like I touched on earlier is usually better in my opinion. And I suggest that you just mention it where it first becomes relevant. You
Mm,
don't have to mention it way out ahead of time, just where it becomes relevant, mention it. And again, showing something just in time for it to be vitally relevant should always be the goal rather than telling the reader something just in case it's
Mm,
relevant later. Second, in my answer here, remember that you can show things through secondary characters long before it's relevant to your protagonist if you want to. For example, in chapter one, you could show a woman begging for money, and the protagonist sneers, thinking that's, what unwed mothers deserve in this society in their mindset, and use that as the relevant introduction and setup for later when that protagonist becomes an unwed mother and has to deal with and overcome and face that bigotry that she herself held.
mm,
And then, third part of this answer, yes, things can absolutely evolve over the course of the story. That can mean the protagonist's mindset evolves, or it can mean that the cultural mindset around them evolves, or you could just develop how you explore and present the topic to the reader in more variety and more depth as the story goes along. Just be sure to double check that that if you directly contradict a previous mention of that intangible, you address that sufficiently. So if your evolution is, all right, at the beginning of the book, unwed mothers are to be shunned universally. And then halfway through the book, you have a different character who shows up and was like, "Oh no, I have a home to give these people a home and purpose and money and help them get back on their feet." That should matter. There should be a sentence in there of, okay, well, this person is outside the norm. Or the person at the beginning was outside the norm and the author misled the setup. You need to address it if you run into contradictions.
mhm. Yeah. Cool.
Cool. Well,
I
thank
was
you.
also thinking, sorry.
No, go for it.
No, I was also thinking that like if the circumstances for the character changes, it forces them to consider to pay attention to other things. Like if they start off and like everything's fine and they have their family and everything's good, and then say for example they end up on the run, all of a sudden they're going to be paying attention a lot more to their surroundings and different things because rather than before where they were just like la di da, you know that may be another thing where they start like all of a sudden that's when they need to be aware of these things that just sort of passing things that they knew. All of a sudden it's like no, now they really need to pay attention to that shit because it's like it's just you on the highway with your one good leg, right? Like
Absolutely.
now you need to pay attention. Okay,
Well,
so this has been so much fun.
good.
Thank you so much.
You're
Okay.
very welcome. Thank you for stepping in to guest host this show. It
No
was it was
problem.
an absolute pleasure. I love getting off track and just talking through things. So yeah, next week you and I again together will go over the more tangible side of the world building to wrap up this topic.
Mhm.
For now, I will thank all of our listeners for following along with this series. We would appreciate it as always if you can help us out by liking and subscribing to the Heartbound Editing podcast and the Author's Alcove podcast, where you can find lots more content for fantasy writers and readers beyond this joint series. I also encourage all of you to go check out Addy DuLac's awesome historical interracial romance books at addydulacauthor.net. That is ADDYDULACAUTHOR.net. And to follow her on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at addydulac_author. And I'm very much looking forward to your fourth book coming out in September. Thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make your good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more, or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.